Chapter 11 of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Harron and A. B. Poland. Chapter 11. Camillus. 1. About 380 years before the birth of Christ, the Romans had another war with the Vientians. During this war, they tried to take the rich city of Veii, which was about 12 miles from Rome. But there was a great wall of stone all around the city, and the gates, which were of brass, were very high and very strong. So the Romans, though they tried as hard as they could for 7 years, were not able to take Veii. And to make matters worse for them, it was reported that 12 Etruscan cities were going to send armies to help the Vientians. It was also said that as soon as the 12 armies had driven the Romans away from the walls of Veii, they would march to Rome and destroy the city. The Romans were much alarmed by these reports, and they resolved that there should be a dictator. So the Senate appointed a dictator, and the man appointed was Marcus Furius Camillus. Camillus was one of the greatest men of Rome. He belonged to a very rich and powerful family, and he was a great soldier. When he was made dictator, he raised a large army and marched at once to Veii. He tried a long time to break down the walls or gates, but he could not do it. Then he thought of the plan of digging a tunnel under the walls. This seemed a good idea, so Camillus set a great number of his men to work. Soon they had a tunnel dug under the walls, and so far under the city that they thought they were as far as the great temple of Juno, which was in the fort or strongest part of Veii. Here they stopped to consider what next to do. Suddenly the sound of voices, as of people talking in the temple above them, reached their ears. So they sent for Camillus, and when he came, he listened to the voices. Now it happened that at this moment the king of Veii was in the temple preparing to offer an ox as a sacrifice to Juno, and praying to the goddess to save the city from the Romans. The ox was killed, and its carcass was ready to be laid on the altar. After the king had prayed, one of the priests, pretending that he had received an answer from Juno, cried out, "The goddess declares she will give victory to him who offers this as a sacrifice upon the altar." As soon as Camillus, who was listening all the time, heard these words of the priest, he ordered his men to break an opening in the earth over their heads. This was quickly done, and the Romans sprang through into the midst of the worshippers. They at once seized the carcass of the ox, and Camillus himself offered it upon the altar to Juno. Then he and his companions rushed out of the temple and opened the gates of the city before the astonished and frightened people knew what was being done. As soon as the gates were opened, the Roman soldiers poured in by the thousands. The Vientians fought bravely, but they were quickly defeated, and their great and rich city was at last in the hands of the Romans. In those times, as has already been said, it was the custom to divide among the victorious soldiers the valuable things taken from a defeated enemy. The riches of Veii were, therefore, divided among the Roman soldiers, and there were so many precious things, gold and silver and jewelry, that the men were quite rich when each got his share. 2. Some time after the taking of Veii, the Romans were at war with the Philicians and other people of Etruria, and Camillus went with an army to besiege their chief town, which was called Falerii. He made his camp in front of the walls, stationed soldiers all around, and tried hard to take the town. But the Philicians were very strong and brave, and they defended their town so well that Camillus began to be afraid he would not be able to take it at all. Now there was at the time in Falerii a schoolmaster who taught the sons of the chief citizens of the town. This schoolmaster used to take his boys every day for a walk outside the walls. One day he led them within the lines of the Roman army, and brought them into the camp of Camillus. Camillus was surprised at seeing the boys. He asked the schoolmaster who they were, and why he had brought them there. The schoolmaster told who the boys were, and then said, "I bring them here to give them up to you. In doing this, I give you up the city, for their fathers will surrender the city to you in order to get back their children." Camillus stood for a moment in silence, gazing at the traitor with a look of disgust. Then, in an angry voice, he cried out, "Villain, we Romans are not so base as you are. We do not make war upon children, but upon men who do us wrong." He then ordered some of his soldiers to tie the schoolmaster's hands behind his back, and to give each of the boys a rod, telling them to scourge the traitor before them into the city. This the boys did with a hearty good will. They whipped the unworthy schoolmaster into fowlery, and when the people saw the sight, and heard of the noble conduct of Camillus, they resolved not to fight any more against so good a man. So they sent ambassadors to Rome to make peace, and the Romans and Philicians became good friends. 3. Not long after this time, one of the tribunes brought a charge against Camillus that he had kept for his own use more than his fair share of the spoils of Veii. Some valuable things were noticed in his house, and it was said that he had not got them as part of his share. It was believed, therefore, that he had taken them secretly from Veii. The Romans were very particular upon this point. They had strict laws for the division of spoils obtained in war, and no one was permitted to take more than he was entitled to, according to his rank in the army. Camillus was summoned to appear in the people's court to answer the charge made against him, but he would not humble himself so much as to go before the plebeians to be tried. He preferred rather to leave Rome forever. So the great Camillus departed from his native city, intending never to return. As he passed out of the gates, he prayed to the gods that some dreadful thing might happen to the Romans, so that they would be forced to call him back again to Rome to save the city. And very soon something did happen, which compelled the Romans to ask for the help of Camillus. For a long time a people called the Gauls had been doing a great deal of mischief in some parts of Italy. These people came from the country now known as France, which in ancient times was called Gaul. Thousands of them made their way across the high mountains called the Alps, and settled on the plains of northern Italy. For many years they lived in this region. Then they heard that further south the country was very beautiful, and was rich in corn and cattle, so they started out in great numbers to conquer it. They were a strange, savage people, very different from the Romans or the Etruscans. They were very tall and strong, and had long, shaggy black hair and dark, fierce faces, so that they appeared very terrible to the Italians. In battle they showed all their savage nature. They rushed furiously at their enemies, yelling at the top of their voices, flourishing enormous swords, and blowing trumpets. The chief or king of the Gauls at this time was called Brennus. He was a man of great strength and size. He wore a golden collar around his neck, and on his arms, which were bare, he sometimes wore bracelets of gold. The Gauls found the southern lands very much to their liking. They robbed farms, attacked some of the Etruscan cities, and then, after a short time, they marched for Rome. A great Roman army went out to fight them, and two armies met on the banks of a river called the Allia. The Roman soldiers had never before seen the dreadful Gauls. They were, therefore, greatly terrified when the tall, fierce-looking savages came running over the plains in vast numbers, shouting furiously and blowing their trumpets. And though the Roman general, Marcus Manlius, tried to make his men go forward bravely to meet the Gauls, it was useless. They fought badly and were killed by thousands. At last they ran from the field and fled toward Rome. 4. When the defeated soldiers reached Rome and told what had happened, there was great terror in the city. Most of the people bundled up their household goods and fled to hiding places in the mountains close by, where they thought they would be safe from the Gauls. But many of the senators and other brave men, both nobles and plebeians, instead of running away from the city, went up to the Capitol, fastened the gates, and made ready for a siege. The Capitol was the most sacred part of the city. It contained splendid statues of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and, as you know, the famous Sibylline books. Some old men who had been consuls resolved to remain in the city and wait for the Gauls to come. They thought that if the Gauls should kill them, they would then be satisfied and would spare the city. So the patriotic old men dressed themselves in their finest robes and sat in chairs in the forum, each with an ivory staff in his right hand. When the Gauls reached the city, there was no one to oppose them. They marched on to the forum and found the old men, with long white beards, sitting in their chairs, so still that they looked like statues. A Gaul went up to one of them and pulled his beard to see if he were a living person. Instantly the old man raised his staff and struck the barbarian in the face. The Gauls then fell upon the patriots and killed them. Then they began to plunder. After destroying the greater part of the city, the Gauls turned their attention to the Capitol. The rock on which it was built was high and steep. Brennus led his soldiers up the hill, but the Romans in the Capitol rushed down the narrow road, and after a few minutes of brave fighting drove them back. The Gauls made another attempt, but it was no more successful than the first. Brennus saw that the Romans could not be driven from the Capitol. He therefore decided to starve them out. He put a strong guard at the entrance, so that the Romans could not come out to get food. For weeks the Capitol was thus besieged, but its faithful defenders